Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
It all started innocently enough. I moved into this quiet, picturesque neighborhood with its perfectly manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, thinking it would be a peaceful place to settle down. Little did I know I was stepping into a world of rules so specific and bizarre that it felt like I'd joined a secret society with a vendetta against individuality. The Homeowners Association, or HOA as everyone called it, was the unofficial ruler of this suburban kingdom, and let me tell you, they took their job very seriously. The first clue that things were going to be interesting came in the form of a welcome packet. It wasn't just a friendly "hi, welcome to the neighborhood" kind of thing. No, it was a 27-page document filled with rules, regulations, and fines for every conceivable infraction. I skimmed through it, chuckling at some of the more ridiculous ones. Lawn ornaments must not exceed 12 inches in height. Parking on the street between the hours of 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. is strictly prohibited. All exterior paint colors must be approved by the HOA board. I figured it was just a formality, something they had to include to cover their bases. Boy, was I wrong. The first incident happened about a week after I moved in. I was sitting on my porch enjoying my morning coffee when I noticed a woman in a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses walking up my driveway. She was holding a clipboard and had the kind of posture that screamed, "I'm here to ruin your day." "Good morning," she said, her tone overly cheerful. "I'm Margaret from the HOA Compliance Committee, just doing my routine inspection." "Inspection?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "For what?" "Oh, just making sure everything's up to code," she said, already scribbling something on her clipboard. "You know, lawn height, exterior decor, that sort of thing." I glanced at my lawn, which looked perfectly fine to me. Sure, go ahead." Margaret walked around my yard like she was on a mission, pausing every few steps to jot something down. Finally, she stopped in front of my porch and looked up at me with a tight smile. "I'm afraid there's a problem." "What kind of problem?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "Your mailbox," she said, pointing to the perfectly normal, perfectly functional mailbox at the end of my driveway. "It's not regulation." "What's wrong with it?" I asked, genuinely confused. "It's the wrong shade of beige," she said, as if that explained everything. "All mailboxes in the neighborhood must be sandstone sunset, as approved by the HOA board. Yours is more of a desert dawn." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. But she just stood there, clipboard in hand, looking completely serious. "You're kidding, right?" "I'm afraid not," she said. "You'll need to repaint it within the next 7 days or you'll be fined." I opened my mouth to argue, but she was already walking away, her heels clicking against the pavement. I looked at my mailbox, then back at Margaret's retreating figure, and sighed. This was going to be a long year. Things only escalated from there. A few days later, I received another notice, this time about my lawn. Apparently, the grass was too uniform in height and needed textural variation to comply with HOA standards. I had no idea what that even meant, but I wasn't about to risk another fine, so I hired a landscaper to come in and add some textural variation to my yard. He showed up with a truckload of plants, rocks, and mulch, and spent an entire day transforming my lawn into what looked like a miniature golf course. It was excessive, to say the least, but when Margaret came back for her follow-up inspection, she actually smiled. "Much better," she said, nodding approvingly. "This is exactly the kind of aesthetic we're going for." I didn't have the heart to tell her I had no idea what I was doing. I just smiled and nodded, hoping this would be the end of it. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The next notice came in the form of a brightly colored flyer slipped under my door one morning. It was an announcement about the upcoming Neighborhood Beautification Contest, where residents would compete to have the most aesthetically pleasing exterior decor. The prize? A $50 gift card to a local hardware store. The catch? Participation was mandatory. I groaned, tossing the flyer onto the counter. This was getting out of hand. But I figured if I was going to be forced to participate, I might as well go all out. I spent the next week scouring the internet for the most outrageous lawn ornaments and exterior decor I could find. A life-sized flamingo? Check. A windmill that actually spun? Check. A fountain that lit up at night? Double check. By the time I was done, my yard looked like a cross between a carnival and a botanical garden. The day of the contest, I stood on my porch watching as a group of HOA board members walked through the neighborhood, clipboards in hand. When they reached my house, they stopped dead in their tracks, staring at the chaos I had created. Margaret, who was leading the group, looked like she was about to have an aneurysm. "What is this?" she asked, gesturing to the flamingo, which was currently wearing a pair of sunglasses. "This," I said, grinning, "is my interpretation of aesthetically pleasing." Margaret opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again, clearly at a loss for words. The other board members exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said anything. Finally, Margaret just shook her head and moved on to the next house. I thought I had won. I thought I had finally pushed the boundaries far enough to make them back off, but I was wrong. The next morning I woke up to a knock on my door. It was Margaret, looking more serious than I had ever seen her. "We need to talk," she said, holding up a stack of papers. "What now?" I asked, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "Your decor," she said, choosing her words carefully. "It's causing a disturbance." "A disturbance," I repeated. "How?" "The fountain," she said. "It's too loud, and the lights are distracting." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "You're telling me my fountain is too loud?" "Yes," she said, nodding. "And the flamingo? Well, let's just say it's not in keeping with the tone of the neighborhood." I couldn't help it. I laughed. "You're serious?" "Deadly," she said, her expression not changing. "You have 48 hours to remove the offending items or you'll be fined." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that this was ridiculous, that she had no right to dictate what I did with my own property. But I knew it wouldn't do any good. So I just nodded and closed the door. As I stood in my living room, staring out at the chaos I had created, I couldn't help but wonder how far this would go. How many more rules would they come up with? How much more money would I have to spend to keep them happy? And most importantly, how much of my sanity would I lose in the process? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that this was far from over, and as much as I wanted to fight back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was just one small cog in a much larger, much more absurd machine. So I did the only thing I could do. I grabbed a paintbrush and headed outside to repaint my mailbox. Again. HOAs are the absolute worst. Who gives these people the right to dictate what color your mailbox should be or how your lawn looks? It's your property, not theirs. The fact that someone has to repaint their mailbox because it's the wrong shade of beige is beyond ridiculous. These rules are just power trips for people with nothing better to do than harass their neighbors. If I were in this situation, I'd be tempted to paint the mailbox neon pink just to see what they'd do. Honestly, HOAs need to be abolished. They're just legalized bullying. Okay, but why does this HOA care so much about a fountain being too loud? Are they seriously that bored? It's not like it's a rock concert in the backyard, it's water flowing. And the flamingo? Who gets upset over a flamingo? This whole thing reeks of control freaks who get off on micromanaging other people's lives. If they're so obsessed with neighborhood tone, maybe they should focus on something actually important, like fixing potholes or improving community safety. Instead, they're out here harassing someone over a bird statue. Get a life, HOA. Reading this made me so mad. How can anyone justify forcing someone to spend hundreds or even thousands of dollars just to meet some arbitrary aesthetic standard? Textural variation in grass. Are you kidding me? That's not even a real thing. It's just an excuse to fine people and make them jump through hoops. HOAs are nothing but money grabs disguised as community standards. If they really cared about the neighborhood, they'd focus on actual issues, not harassing people over lawn ornaments. This whole system is broken, and stories like this prove it.
If you like our stories, then please like and subscribe and comment, and remember to hit that bell icon so you never miss out. We have new stories almost every day.
I always knew HOAs had ridiculous rules, but I never imagined just how far they could go until I decided to push the boundaries. It all started when I moved into a neighborhood that prided itself on having strict but fair HOA regulations. The place looked nice enough. Perfectly mowed lawns, identical mailboxes, and driveways that all seemed to be copied and pasted from a single blueprint. I thought, why not have a little fun with this? So I made it my mission to test just how much money, creativity, and patience it would take to turn my house into an HOA-approved spectacle. It started with the lawn. The HOA had specific guidelines about grass length, so I figured, why stop at grass? I hired a professional landscaping team and transformed my front yard into a work of art. Literal topiary sculptures of mythological creatures. A 12-foot dragon curled around a fountain. A life-sized Pegasus posed mid-gallop near the mailbox. And a centaur loomed over my driveway like a guardian of suburban conformity. It was a masterpiece, and it cost me a fortune. The first complaint letter arrived within the week. Sir, your lawn ornaments must be in accordance with Section 4.3 of the HOA guidelines, which state that decorations must be reasonable and tasteful. I laughed. What's more tasteful than a perfectly sculpted Pegasus? I responded with a formal letter asking for clarification. The HOA president, Mrs. Harper, a woman whose entire personality revolved around enforcing these ridiculous rules, scheduled an emergency review. At the meeting, Mrs. Harper sat at the head of the table in the community center, flanked by 3 other board members who all looked equally annoyed. She sighed dramatically and slid a copy of the HOA guidelines across the table. "You're pushing it, Mr. James." "This isn't a theme park," she said, adjusting her reading glasses as if she were about to lay down the law in a courtroom. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. "I fail to see where in the guidelines it says I can't have artistic landscaping." One of the board members, a guy named Tom who had the charisma of a wet sponge, cleared his throat. "The word reasonable is key here. So if I replace the dragon with a smaller animal, say a bunny, that would be reasonable." Mrs. Harper's jaw tightened. "We're not here to negotiate. The sculptures need to go." I could see their patience wearing thin, but I wasn't done yet. Next up, the mailbox. The HOA had an unspoken rule about everyone having the same boring black metal mailbox, so I installed a custom one that looked like a miniature replica of my house. It even had a tiny working light that turned on at night. A neighbor walked by while I was admiring it and muttered, "They're gonna have a field day with this one." Sure enough, another letter arrived. "Your mailbox is in violation of uniformity standards." This time I didn't even bother responding. I just swapped it out for something even worse. A fully functional, old-timey British red telephone booth. The next HOA meeting was practically a public trial. Mrs. Harper's face was turning an impressive shade of red as she flipped through the growing stack of complaints about my property. "This is beyond absurd. You are actively trying to provoke us," she snapped. "I'm following the rules," I said. "If the guidelines don't specify what I can and can't do, then it's open to interpretation, isn't it?" the board murmured among themselves. One of them, a man who looked like he hadn't smiled since the 80s, muttered, "This is why we need stricter wording." But the fun wasn't over yet. Parking regulations were next. The HOA allowed 2 cars per driveway, but nothing in the rule book mentioned anything about decorative vehicles. So I went all in. I bought a vintage Rolls-Royce and converted it into a massive flower planter. It sat elegantly in my driveway, overflowing with roses, violets, and creeping ivy. It was stunning. People actually stopped to take pictures. The HOA, however, was less than impressed. "This is not a vehicle," Mrs. Harper fumed at the next meeting. "It's a flower bed disguised as a car." "Well, it has an engine," I pointed out. "And wheels. Just because it's decorated doesn't mean it's not a car. You're deliberately making a mockery of this community," she hissed. "I'm just following the rules." By now, the entire neighborhood was either entertained or furious. Some people loved my antics. Others started whispering about new rules being drafted just to shut me down. But I wasn't finished. I had one final project: holiday decorations. The HOA was very strict about seasonal decorations being modest. No inflatables, no blinking lights past 9 p.m., no excessive displays. Naturally, I took that as a challenge. For Halloween, I turned my front yard into a full horror movie set. Animatronic zombies burst from the ground, skeletons played poker at a makeshift table, and fog machines spilled mist onto the sidewalk. The pièce de résistance, a life-sized Grim Reaper that lunged forward whenever someone got too close. The HOA lost its mind. A formal complaint was hand-delivered to my door, listing noise violations, light pollution, and disturbing the peace. I barely finished reading it before I got an email about an emergency community vote to change the rules immediately. At the meeting, Mrs. Harper looked like she had aged 10 years in a single month. "Enough is enough," she said. "This is a respectable community, not a circus." I sat back, pretending to think it over. "So let me get this straight. The rules were too vague before, and now you're rewriting them just because you don't like my interpretation?" The entire room was silent. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others, mostly the rule-loving HOA loyalists, nodded along with Mrs. Harper. "This isn't about you," she finally said, voice tight. "It's about maintaining order." I could have fought them. I could have gone full petty and dragged it out even longer. But honestly, I'd already made my point. That's when I saw the latest draft of the HOA's new regulations, fresh off the printer. A full 12 pages dedicated to the new rules, each one carefully written to counter every single thing I had done. I smirked. They were rewriting the entire book because of me. I'd won, but I wasn't finished just yet. So let me get this straight. The HOA couldn't be bothered to write clear rules in the first place, but the second someone outsmarts them, they scramble to rewrite the entire book. That tells you everything you need to know. They don't care about standards or the community. They just want control. The fact that they had to hold emergency meetings, send endless complaint letters, and waste everyone's time just to stop one guy from having a little fun proves how ridiculous these people are. Imagine if they put half that energy into something useful, like fixing the cracked sidewalks or dealing with the actual problems in the neighborhood. HOAs are just a way for bored, power-hungry busybodies to pretend they're important. The fact that they rewrote 12 pages of rules just because of one guy's decorations is embarrassing. Who cares if he has a mailbox that actually looks nice or Halloween decorations that people enjoy? No one's property value is tanking because of a flower-filled Rolls-Royce. These people aren't protecting the neighborhood. They're just miserable control freaks who can't stand someone not bowing to their nonsense. They act like a dragon-shaped bush is some kind of crisis. But if someone's real issue gets ignored, not our problem. I love how the HOA board was totally fine until someone followed their rules too well. Suddenly it's an emergency. Oh no, a Pegasus in the front yard, a tiny house-shaped mailbox, a Halloween display that's fun. These people act like he was storing nuclear waste in his driveway. The best part, they had to hold special votes just to deal with him, like he was some criminal mastermind instead of a guy with a sense of humor. You know what's really bringing down the neighborhood? The HOA's miserable attitude.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.